The worst part was not the hatred. He had learned to live with the hiss of spit on the cobblestones, the muttered curses that followed him like stray dogs, and the rigid backs that turned away when he entered the market square. The worst part, the grinding, soul-crushing agony that Zacchaeus endured daily, was the inescapable, cold reality that the hatred was entirely justified. Every shekel in the immense, iron-bound chest beneath his bed, every silk cushion embroidered with gold thread, every slave serving his table, was purchased not just with wealth, but with the stolen breath of his own people. He was the chief tax collector of Jericho, a city strategically crucial, flourishing with the rich bomb trade and pilgrims entering Jerusalem. And he was Rome's most efficient, most loathed instrument of financial extraction. His mornings always began the same way. Before the heat of the sun turned the valley into a brass oven, he would sit, staring at his reflection in the polished bronze tray that held his dates, seeing the grimace of a man who had traded his heritage for comfort. He wasn't physically imposing. Quite the opposite. His shortness was a constant, stinging reminder of his inadequacy, a flaw he had sought to smother beneath layers of status and authority. His wealth was his armor, but the metal was thin, and the insults always found their way through. He knew the numbers, the base rate, the accepted Roman tariff, and the percentage he systematically squeezed on top, the personal premium that funded his gilded cage. He remembered the face of the potter whose cart he had seized for a negligible debt inflated tenfold, the quiet shame in the eyes of the widow whose olive oil harvest barely fed her children after he took his cut. These faces did not fade. They were the ghostly currency he spent every time he opened his mouth to order a servant or sign a levy. He wasn't simply rich. He was captive to his riches, trapped in a relentless cycle of needing more power to justify the rejection he already felt. Today, however, felt heavier. A feverish, almost manic energy had gripped the city. It wasn't the usual pilgrimage rush. The noise was different, excited, reverent, bordering on chaotic. He dismissed his scribe early, the scratching of the quill grating on his nerves. He didn't need the figures today. He needed silence, but the city would not grant it. He walked to the window, peering through the meticulously carved latticework that shaded his opulent courtyard. He watched the stream of people flowing towards the main road, the road that led from the Jordan crossing. They moved with a singular purpose, whispering one name, a name that had begun to pierce the thick walls of cynicism he had built around his heart: Jesus of Nazareth. Zacchaeus hated hope. Hope was a vulnerability, a weakness that people like him could exploit. But as he watched the genuine, desperate hunger in the faces of the crowds, a tremor ran through his self-control. He was the chief tax collector. He was protected by Roman law and legions of greed. Yet, he was the most exposed man in Jericho, standing utterly alone on a mountain of misappropriated silver, dreading the day he would have to answer for the spiritual bankruptcy that mirrored his financial success. He knew, with terrifying certainty, that if he were to fall ill or face danger, the entire city would rejoice. His life was a successful, functional disaster, and today, that itinerant preacher was walking right into the heart of his carefully constructed ruin. The financial machinery Zacchaeus oversaw was complex, ruthless, and utterly efficient. Jericho was a jewel in the Roman crown, mainly due to the immense revenue generated by its proximity to the trade routes and the production of highly valuable balsam. Zacchaeus wasn't just skimming. He was orchestrating a systemic robbery under the guise of legal adherence. His office was a fortress of scrolls and receipts, each parchment documenting not just taxes paid, but lives strained to the breaking point. He had mastered the subtle art of creative accounting, the intentional misclassification of goods, the arbitrary valuation of imported textiles, the sudden, unexplained fines levied for minor infractions of obscure Roman statutes. These were not mistakes. They were intentional levers of control. Just last week, he had dealt with a delegation of local spice merchants who pleaded that the new tariffs on cinnamon would ruin their families. Zacchaeus had listened, resting his chin on a hand weighed down by several heavy gold rings, his expression one of clinical boredom. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't threatened violence. He had simply pointed to the scroll of Roman edicts, a document intentionally complex and translated into poorly phrased Aramaic, and explained that any failure to comply would result in the confiscation of their entire inventory and perhaps the enslavement of their indebted sons. The merchants had left, their faces bleached with despair, and Zacchaeus had immediately instructed his ledger keeper to add a 2% personal surcharge to all future spice imports, citing unnecessary administrative inconvenience caused by their visit. This level of cold, calculated cruelty was not born of natural malice, but of deep, persistent shame. He needed the wealth to affirm his worth, to prove to himself and the world that his power compensated for his diminutive stature and his moral compromise. His house was ostentatious, a clear defiance to the ascetic poverty of the Pharisees and the simple living of the average Judean family. Every piece of imported furniture, every expensive slave, was a middle finger to the society that rejected him. But these displays were exhausting. The higher the walls he built around himself, the clearer it became that he was trapped inside. He tried to alleviate the loneliness with banquets, inviting minor Roman officials and less scrupulous local collaborators. But the conversation was always forced, transactional, and devoid of true connection. He was the host, the provider, the chief source of entertainment, but never truly a friend. When the laughter faded and the servants cleared the tables, the silence in his vast house was deafening, a monument to his isolation. He would often wake in the middle of the night, haunted by the specter of judgment, not from Rome, which protected him, but from the God of Abraham, whose laws he flouted daily. He was financially solvent but spiritually bankrupt, the chief tax collector of the human soul, charging exorbitant interest on borrowed grace. He knew the stories of the prophets, the warnings against unjust weights and measures. He knew he was walking a path straight into eternal darkness, but the chains of gold he wore felt too heavy to break. The noise outside was a sudden eruption, pulling him from his dark reverie. The Jesus phenomenon was now pressing against the very gates of his district, bringing an unprecedented level of agitation. Zacchaeus had heard the rumors, the stories that seemed impossible yet whispered with palpable truth. He healed the blind, gave voice to the mute, and even raised the dead. But the most unsettling rumor, the one that truly snagged at the frayed edges of Zacchaeus' soul, was that this Jesus ate with sinners. He didn't just tolerate them, he sought them out. This was a concept utterly foreign to Zacchaeus' worldview, where acceptance was always conditional upon wealth or power. Could it be true? Could there be a kindness that existed without a corresponding ledger entry? The city was now an artery pulsating with human traffic, all moving toward the main highway. Zacchaeus finally stepped out, not toward his counting house, but toward the noise, drawn by an irresistible, desperate curiosity he couldn't name. It was not belief that drove him, but a terrifying hope mixed with the morbid fascination of seeing the man who claimed to speak for God, whom the common people seemed to adore, and whom the religious authorities were already preparing to crucify, metaphorically or literally. Zacchaeus tried to maintain his dignity, walking with the stiff posture of authority, but the moment he was swallowed by the crowd, that authority vanished. He was merely a small, richly dressed man in a river of towering hostility. People actively shifted to block his path. They weren't subtle. A farmer deliberately swung his heavy basket, nearly striking Zacchaeus, then offered a faux apology laced with venom. A group of women whispered loudly about the Roman lapdog, polluting the air they breathed. Zacchaeus felt the familiar burn of humiliation, but this time, it was amplified by the urgency of his mission. He just had to see the Nazarene. Why? He didn't want a miracle of healing. His body was healthy. He didn't need wealth. He was already swimming in it. He needed a miracle of affirmation, perhaps just a fleeting moment of contact that might prove he was still human, still salvageable. But the crowd was unforgiving. The Galilean was apparently just arriving, and the mass of humanity was shoulder to shoulder, pushing and jostling. Zacchaeus tried to use his elbows, resorting to the aggressive tactics he usually employed in the marketplace. But here, in the presence of this revered figure, the people felt empowered to resist him. They wouldn't budge for the despised tax collector. His short stature, usually irrelevant when he was seated behind his massive desk, became an insurmountable physical barrier. He could see the tops of heads, the fluttering edge of a shawl, the hot, dusty air thick with anticipation, but not the man himself. He pushed, he strained, he even shouted once, demanding they make way for the chief tax collector. But the demand was swallowed by the roar of the crowd, answered only by sneers. A crushing wave of despair hit him. Of course, he couldn't see him. His sins had created a wall of people too high and too wide for his short legs to navigate. He was literally and metaphorically separated from grace by the consequence of his own actions. He was about to turn back, to retreat to the cold comfort of his gold-lined prison, when a desperate, almost childlike instinct took over. The street was lined with trees, large sycamore fig trees that offered shade and occasionally edible fruit. They were not particularly tall, but their branches were sturdy and low-hanging. The thought was instantly ridiculous, humiliating. The chief tax collector, the most powerful Jew in Jericho, climbing a tree like a common urchin trying to steal figs. It was an act of public surrender, abandoning all pretense of dignity and authority. Yet the longing to see this man, this Jesus, transcended his fear of ridicule. He couldn't go through the crowd, he would go over it. Driven by a primal urge, a desperate lurch toward salvation he didn't even recognize as such. He broke away from the dense mass, ran toward the nearest sycamore, and with surprising agility for a man of his age and sedentary lifestyle, scrambled onto the lowest branch, then quickly hoisted himself higher. He settled among the thick, broad leaves, awkwardly draped over a limb, utterly exposed, deeply ashamed, yet finally able to see. He was above the chaos, watching Jesus approach, waiting for the moment of clarity, ready to absorb the spectacle that everyone else was praising. Perched precariously in the sycamore tree, Zacchaeus felt every eye in the crowd burning into his back, even the eyes of those who couldn't see him. He felt like a fool, utterly stripped of the false identity he had maintained for decades. The rustle of the leaves provided little cover, and the rough bark chafed against the fine linen of his tunic. He could hear the escalating cheers, the sound of the crowd parting slightly, indicating that the Nazarene was very close now. He swallowed hard, trying to slow his frantic breathing. He told himself he was merely observing a phenomenon, satisfying his intellectual curiosity about a popular demagogue. But the raw, aching honesty deep within him screamed a different truth. He was hiding, desperately seeking a vantage point from which to witness something pure, something untouched by the corruption that defined his own life. Finally, Jesus came into view. He was not wearing the robes of a king, nor the severe attire of a Pharisee. He walked simply, surrounded by a tight cluster of disciples, his face perhaps a little dustier than most, bearing the weight of constant travel and incessant demands. But what struck Zacchaeus was not the physical appearance, but the quality of his attention. Jesus wasn't merely walking through the crowd. He was seeing it. His gaze was attentive, absorbing the desperate hopes and whispered petitions with an astonishing calm. He seemed to move at the epicenter of the storm, completely undisturbed by the surrounding frenzy. Zacchaeus gripped the branch tightly, his knuckles white. He studied the faces of the people reaching out to Jesus, the sick, the poor, the hopeful. He saw acceptance, not judgment, reflected in the eyes of the teacher. This was the man who ate with tax collectors, who offered kindness without demanding a signed ledger. The reality of it was almost unbearable. Zacchaeus, high up in his shameful perch, felt a profound, internal groan. He realized that for all his gold and all his power, he was the neediest person in the whole city, perhaps more so than the blind beggar by the gate. He was morally blind, emotionally paralyzed, and utterly alone. Then the inevitable happened. Jesus reached the exact spot beneath the sycamore tree. The noise of the crowd, which had been a continuous roar, suddenly dampened, as if someone had thrown a thick blanket over the square. Zacchaeus watched, heart pounding, as Jesus paused. Not just paused, but stopped completely. And then, slowly, deliberately, Jesus turned his head. His eyes lifted, scanning the leaves, finding the small, trembling figure hidden among the branches. It was not a surprised look, nor a condemnatory stare, but one of absolute, unblinking knowing. The gaze was instantaneous and total, cutting through the wealth, the shame, and the sycamore leaves with effortless precision. Zacchaeus felt as though a great hand had reached into his chest and momentarily stopped his heart. He was seen, not as the chief tax collector, not as the hated collaborator, but simply as Zacchaeus. The air stood still, and the only sound was the frantic thudding inside his own ears. And as Jesus looked up at the ridiculous, perched figure, he smiled. A genuine, warm, and utterly unearned smile. He then spoke, his voice clear and amplified by a silent power that transcended the noise of the thousands gathered below, addressing the short man in the tree by name, as if they were old friends meeting unexpectedly in a remote courtyard. The shock held Zacchaeus momentarily immobile, a frozen statue of shame and burgeoning hope. This moment, suspended between the indignity of the tree and the miracle of recognition, required the full attention of everyone watching. This single point of contact between the holiest man in Judea and the most despised man in Jericho shattered every expectation of how God interacts with humanity. It is in these moments of profound, raw exposure that we face the deepest parts of ourselves. Zacchaeus, up in that tree, was forced to confront his entire life, stripped of all pretense. And perhaps that is the question we all face when we encounter profound truth. When you are caught in an act of desperation, when your mask of dignity has fallen, and you are entirely exposed, what is the deepest truth about yourself you pray that Jesus, or any source of grace, sees beneath the surface? What is the one thing you are truly hiding in the sycamore leaves? Share your thoughts below about what it means to be truly seen in your most undignified moment. The simple sound of his name, spoken by Jesus, held more authority than a Roman legion. It cut through the cacophony of the crowd and the self-condemnation raging inside Zacchaeus' mind. "Zacchaeus," Jesus said, still looking directly at the tree, his gaze utterly unwavering, "make haste and come down, for I must stay at your house today." Must. Not "I would like to," or "if you would be so kind." It was a divine imperative, a statement of undeniable purpose. Zacchaeus felt his world tilt. He didn't just feel seen, he felt chosen. The man who had spent his life meticulously planning every transaction, calculating every risk, was suddenly confronted with a scenario that defied all logic and expectation. The Messiah, the promised one, the healer of all ills, was demanding to be his guest. And not just any guest, a guest who must stay. The effect on the crowd was immediate and seismic. A collective gasp rippled through the thousands. The low murmur of reverence quickly transformed into a loud, angry grumbling. Zacchaeus heard the voices clearly, voices that had hated him for years, now energized by righteous indignation. He is going to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. He will defile himself by eating at that thief's table. Why choose him when there are dozens of righteous families willing to host him? The protests were a fierce wind attempting to pull Zacchaeus back down into the pit of his shame. But Jesus' command was a sturdy anchor. Zacchaeus scrambled down the tree, his movements clumsy and driven by sheer urgency. He didn't wait to brush the dirt and bark from his expensive robes. He barely registered the hostile stares of the crowd. His only focus was the figure standing beneath the tree, radiating a quiet intensity. When he reached the ground, panting, he stood before Jesus, who was significantly taller than him, and felt the immense weight of the moment pressing down. It was humiliation and exhilaration braided together. Jesus simply offered a slight, encouraging nod. "Lead the way, Zacchaeus." The walk from the sycamore tree to Zacchaeus' elaborate, fortress-like home was perhaps the longest, most difficult journey of his life. It was a walk of shame amplified by the immediate presence of salvation. The crowd followed, not silently, but loudly voicing their disapproval, their condemnation hanging in the thick, dusty air. Zacchaeus could feel their collective judgment on his back, a scorching weight. He walked slightly ahead of Jesus, acutely aware of the incongruity of the scene. The celebrated prophet walking willingly into the home of the despised chief sinner. He was the subject of thousands of furious, judgmental glares. Yet, strangely, the hatred didn't sting as much as usual. He realized the difference was that now he wasn't alone. He was walking with the only man in all of Judea who refused to judge him based on his profession or his bank account. When they arrived at the grand, imposing gate of his home, Zacchaeus felt a momentary return of his professional demeanor, ordering his servants to prepare the best room and the most exquisite feast. He needed to prove he was worthy, to show Jesus that he was accustomed to hosting dignitaries. But as he led Jesus through the polished marble foyer, past the imported tapestries and the silver ornaments, the wealth suddenly felt vulgar, hollow, and terribly loud. The opulent house, built to project power and status, now felt like a suffocating mausoleum of misplaced priorities. He ushered Jesus into the courtyard, which was typically a place of cool, reserved silence, and the master sat down calmly, meeting Zacchaeus' eyes not with pity, but with profound acceptance. The silence that followed the initial flurry of activity was dense, heavy, and full of unspoken confession. Zacchaeus knew the feast was irrelevant. The true transaction that was about to occur would not involve silver, tax receipts, or lavish courses, but the deep, terrifying surrender of his entire, disastrous life. The meal was prepared quickly and served with meticulous attention by Zacchaeus' nervous staff, who kept stealing furtive glances at the honored, yet controversial, guest. The table was laden with roasted lamb, fine wine imported from the coast, baskets of fresh dates, and the costly balsam honey for which Jericho was famous. It was a feast fit for a king, yet the atmosphere was far from celebratory. The disciples present were quiet, still reeling from the public outcry and perhaps privately wondering why their teacher would invite such widespread scandal. Jesus, however, seemed perfectly at ease. He ate slowly, deliberately, engaging the servants with gentle questions about their lives, treating the lowest members of the household with a respect Zacchaeus himself rarely bothered to show. This simple act of grace leveled the playing field, dissolving the artificial barriers of wealth and servitude that Zacchaeus had so carefully erected. Zacchaeus, seated across from Jesus, found himself unable to eat. The food tasted like ash. The very sight of the wealth around him, the silver goblets, the jeweled knives, was sickening. All his life, he had sought satisfaction in acquisition, believing that the accumulation of external goods could fill the gaping hole of internal isolation. Now, sitting beside the one man who possessed nothing yet seemed to own the entire universe, Zacchaeus realized his life's work was a catastrophic failure. The silence between them was not awkward. It was charged, a crucible in which Zacchaeus' hardened heart was finally beginning to melt. Jesus didn't preach. He didn't rebuke. He didn't even ask about the tax scrolls. He simply offered presence, a warm, steady, unqualified acceptance that demanded no performance, no payment, and no defense. Zacchaeus' internal monologue, usually a torrent of self-justification and financial calculations, became a single, piercing cry of guilt. He saw the face of the spice merchant, the shame of the widow, the fear in the eyes of every person he had knowingly extorted. He realized that the greatest debt he owed was not to Rome, but to his own soul. He had bartered his integrity piece by piece until nothing was left but a short, rich shell. He felt the overwhelming desire to confess, not because he was prompted, but because the light radiating from Jesus made his own darkness unbearable. The moment became too intense, the quiet grace too powerful. Zacchaeus suddenly pushed back his chair, the scraping sound loud in the courtyard. He stood, trembling, his hands balled into fists, his eyes burning with a mixture of shame and fierce resolution. He didn't look at the disciples, only at Jesus. The confession burst out of him, raw and unplanned, shattering the solemn silence of the meal. "Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor, and if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold." The declaration was staggering. This wasn't the negotiation of a shrewd merchant. It was the desperate plea of a drowning man finally finding air. He hadn't promised to start being generous. He had committed right then and there to a massive, immediate financial reversal. Giving away half his immense wealth was an unthinkable act of charity in the Roman world, where wealth was power. And the fourfold restoration? That was beyond the requirement of the law, which mandated a repayment of the stolen amount plus 20%. Zacchaeus was choosing the most extreme form of repentance known, essentially choosing financial ruin for the sake of spiritual solvency. It was the ultimate catastrophic reversal of his life's philosophy. The chief tax collector was firing himself, liquidating his empire of greed, and buying back his soul at the highest possible price. The spontaneous declaration of restitution hung in the air, echoing the depth of Zacchaeus' repentance. Half his goods to the poor, that would transform countless lives in Jericho overnight. Fourfold repayment for every act of fraud. This was a promise that would empty his coffers and require weeks, perhaps months of painstaking accounting to trace and repay every wronged party. This wasn't merely a gesture. It was a total dismantling of his personal kingdom, a complete financial and professional suicide. He stood there waiting, his breath held captive by the gravity of his own words. He needed confirmation, not approval of the act, but acceptance of the heart behind it. He looked at Jesus, whose face was still calm, still entirely accepting. The disciples, previously muttering or casting nervous glances, were now fixed on their master, awaiting his response to this monumental, impulsive act of radical change. Jesus spoke, his voice measured, pulling the moment out of the realm of human transactions and placing it firmly into the divine. Today, salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. The words settled over Zacchaeus like warm oil. Salvation. The one commodity he could never purchase, the one receipt he could never forge, had been delivered not by his own efforts, but through the sheer grace of a divine visit. And the final phrase, he too is a son of Abraham, was the ultimate restoration. Zacchaeus, who had betrayed his people and his heritage for Roman coin, was reaffirmed as belonging to the covenant, recognized as part of the family he had deliberately alienated. This affirmation was the true reversal of his disaster life. He wasn't just wealthy anymore, he was found. He was no longer defined by his ledger books, but by his lineage of faith. The realization washed over him. His wealth, the source of his pride and his ruin, had suddenly become the tool of his redemption. He could use the corrupt means he had accumulated to perform genuine, life-altering good. The sheer weight of the gold felt lighter now, because it was no longer his burden alone. It was the seed of a new life for himself and for the poor of Jericho. Jesus then elaborated, speaking not just to Zacchaeus but to the silent, watching disciples, giving a mission statement for his presence in the world. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. Zacchaeus realized he was the living evidence of that mission. He was the lost item that the shepherd had searched for, the coin the woman had swept her house to find. The tax collector, the epitome of the unsavable sinner in Jewish society, had been found and claimed. The luncheon continued, but the mood had shifted fundamentally. It was no longer a tense encounter between a sinner and a prophet, but a communion between friends, one recently returned from exile. Zacchaeus began to speak, not of money, but of the people he needed to find, the accounts he needed to settle, the complex network of wrongs he needed to undo. The logistics of fourfold restitution were immense, requiring a moral audit of his entire career. He had defrauded hundreds, perhaps thousands, over many years. This was not a quick fix. This was the beginning of a lifetime of corrective justice. But the dread was gone, replaced by a quiet, determined resolve. The shame that had driven him to climb a tree was replaced by the dignity of a man setting his accounts straight, not just with men, but with his God. The afternoon was spent meticulously preparing for the financial fallout. Zacchaeus called in his chief scribe, a man who had benefited greatly from the chief tax collector's shady dealings but now stared at his master with bewildered horror. Zacchaeus dictated instructions that were nothing short of a revolution. He ordered the immediate calculation of his entire net worth, houses, lands, inventory, and liquid assets, and the designation of half that total for immediate, discrete distribution to the identified poor of the city. More complex was the second task, retrieving every ledger and scroll that detailed the extortions of the past 10 years. This information was highly sensitive and could easily incriminate Zacchaeus and several minor Roman collaborators. But now, secrecy mattered less than righteousness. He instructed the scribe to prepare separate lists. Names of those defrauded, the calculated amount of the original overcharge, and the resulting fourfold restitution amount. The sums were astronomical. The sheer magnitude of the repayment meant that Zacchaeus would be reduced to a fraction of his former wealth. He would not be poor, but he would certainly cease to be the wealthiest man in Jericho, and the foundation of his power would crumble. Yet, the fear of this financial collapse was strangely absent. It was as if the weight of the silver he was giving up was negligible compared to the weight lifted from his conscience. Jesus remained seated throughout this flurry of activity, observing the transformation not just in Zacchaeus' spirit, but in his concrete actions. The Master had not coerced the repentance. He had merely provided the space for Zacchaeus to confess the truth that had been crushing him. The beauty of this grace was that it demanded practical, measurable change. It wasn't enough to feel remorse. Zacchaeus had to actively reverse the damage. As the sun began to dip toward the western hills, painting the sky in fiery hues, Zacchaeus felt a deep hunger, not for food, but for true connection. He dismissed the servants and sat again with Jesus, not as the powerful chief tax collector, but as a student, a man seeking guidance on how to navigate this new, terrifying path of righteousness. He asked Jesus about the nature of mercy, about forgiveness for sins that seemed too massive to pardon, and about how to continue living in a world defined by transactional greed when his own heart was now committed to sacrificial giving. Jesus spoke simply, focusing not on the rules of the law, but on the principles of the kingdom: humility, neighborly love, and the profound peace found in aligning one's actions with divine will. Zacchaeus realized that for years he had been trying to fill a God-sized void with Roman gold. Now that void was filled, and the external world, the hatred of the crowd, the loss of his status, all faded into irrelevance. The single, unifying truth was that he had been sought, found, and saved. The man who was once fired, lost, and hated was now embraced, connected, and redeemed. All thanks to a simple, uninvited lunch. The days that followed the departure of Jesus and his company were chaotic and profoundly transformative for Zacchaeus and for Jericho. The news of the chief tax collector's radical declaration spread like a brushfire. At first, there was intense suspicion. The people of Jericho assumed it was a trick, perhaps a ploy to lure out those Zacchaeus had wronged, only to punish them further. But then, the envelopes began to arrive. Discreetly delivered by Zacchaeus' trusted, albeit bewildered, remaining assistants, the envelopes contained receipts that proved fourfold repayment for specific past extortions, often accompanied by a personal, handwritten note of apology from Zacchaeus himself. For the potter, whose cart had been seized, the repayment was enough to buy 2 new carts and several years of financial security. For the widow whose harvest had been stolen, the recompense allowed her to purchase a small olive grove and secure her future. The initial suspicion turned to stunned silence, then to a hesitant, gradual acceptance. Zacchaeus had not only restored the money, he had restored dignity. He followed through on his promise to the poor, organizing a massive, efficient redistribution of half his goods. Warehouses were opened, stores of grain were released, and funds were given to community leaders Zacchaeus knew to be trustworthy. He had liquidated nearly everything that gave him temporal power, retaining only enough to live modestly and manage the ongoing restitution project. His former peers, the wealthy Roman collaborators and the local elite, viewed him with a mixture of pity and contempt. They saw him as a madman, a fool who had thrown away years of calculated success for a fleeting moment of religious fervor. He was, in their eyes, professionally ruined, socially ostracized by the very people whose approval he once sought. But Zacchaeus found himself entirely liberated from their judgment. The loss of their esteem was irrelevant because he had gained the approval of the one person whose opinion truly mattered. His office, once a dark center of greed and complex accounting, became a hub of justice and reconciliation. He personally oversaw the repayment process, meeting face-to-face with the men and women he had victimized. These encounters were sometimes difficult, filled with lingering bitterness and mistrust, but Zacchaeus met every accusation with sincere humility and acceptance. He didn't try to justify his past. He only sought to mend it. He found that the act of giving back, of voluntarily making himself vulnerable, was far more satisfying than the accumulation of money could ever be. His short stature, once a physical symbol of his inadequacy, no longer mattered. He stood tall in his renewed character, his actions speaking volumes that his former wealth never could. He had transitioned from a life of extraction to a life of contribution, finding his true identity not in what he possessed, but in the radical generosity he displayed. The disaster life was over, replaced by a complex, demanding, yet deeply peaceful existence of ongoing atonement and grace. The true measure of Zacchaeus' transformation was not merely the financial sacrifice, but the deep, existential peace that settled over him. Before the lunch with Jesus, his life had been a constant state of internal war. Sleep was fitful, shadowed by anxiety and the fear of exposure. Every interaction was scrutinized through the lens of transaction. What can I gain? How can I protect this? He was haunted by the knowledge that he was universally hated. Now, the quiet hum of genuine peace filled the spaces formerly occupied by dread. He no longer needed his towering walls or his excessive displays of wealth. He had traded the brittle armor of power for the resilience of humility. He began to spend his time in ways that defied his former character. Instead of meticulously counting tariffs, he devoted hours to teaching the children of the poor how to read and write, using his extensive knowledge of scrolls and ledgers for education rather than extortion. He found simple joys in the small acts of kindness he performed daily. When he walked through Jericho now, the response was radically different. The hissing and spitting had ceased. It was replaced by nods of tentative respect, sometimes even genuine gratitude from the recipients of his unexpected generosity. He knew full well that his past could never be erased, and the community's trust would take years to fully rebuild, but he no longer sought forgiveness from the crowd. He sought only fidelity to the path Jesus had set him upon. He often thought back to that moment high in the sycamore tree. It wasn't the view that saved him. It was the fact that he was willing to make a fool of himself, willing to sacrifice his dignity simply to catch a glimpse of purity. That desperation, that moment of utter surrender, was the point where grace had intersected with his disaster. He understood now that his short stature, the source of so much lifelong insecurity, was exactly what forced him to be seen. Had he been taller, he might have blended into the crowd, maintaining his dignity and anonymity, and Jesus would have walked right past the chief tax collector, who was hiding in plain sight. It was his greatest flaw that led to his greatest moment of grace. His life became a parable in itself, a living testament that no amount of human sin or social condemnation could outrun the persistent, loving pursuit of God. He learned that being saved wasn't a sudden, final event, but the beginning of a life dedicated to active righteousness, a life where every action, every repayment, was an echo of thanks for the unmerited favor he had received. He was fired from his old life of greed, but he was hired into a new life of meaning. He was lost in the crowd, but found in the tree. He was hated, but now, finally, deeply loved by the one who saw past the gilded cage and into the broken man within. He was Zacchaeus, the redeemed son of Abraham, whose lunch with the master had irrevocably reversed his fate, turning a story of corruption into a legend of restoration, proving that even the most desperate situations are merely opportunities for divine intervention, if only we are willing to climb the tree and be seen in our neediness.